One for the. Let me have one. Yeah, just one. Leave me one. Maybe. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. How are you? How's retirement? A man of leisure. It's wonderful. Except the world of healing still needs you. That's the only problem.
He still has that practice.
I had time to learn a half Torah. I'm doing the half Torah.
Oh, you really? Oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Ellie, can you do me a favor? Let's just open that door just a little bit. Yeah, if we can open that door just a little bit, we'll get air. And people will find us. Okay.
If you want a Rotafashim member.
Oh, right.
It doesn't fit yet.
I've been using these topical ideas because these partiota strange.
These are the worst Torah portions.
Yeah. Okay, good morning. Sorry? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. He's okay, I know. Something. Yeah, he's fine. Hi, Pop. He'll be here. One way or the other. Good morning. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for braving the sleet and the rain and the snow and the ice and the hail and the tornadoes to get here. So people from the east don't understand what a quarter inch of rain does to L.A. You know, so it's in the east this is like nothing, you know, but here it's like storm watch, you know. It's a big deal. So thanks for coming out. Good Shabbos. You guys good? Everybody good? First of all, happy birthday to Rabbi Silverman. He turned 95 this week. And much joy, good health, continued joy from your kids. Keep learning with us. We're delighted. It's a great honor to have you here. A couple of other announcements of things going on before we learn together. Today, following our learning today, you're all invited inside. We have davening this morning, and there's no bar mitzvah. There's a baby naming and a few other things, and we have a guest speaker. These next 3 weeks we have guests. So this week it's Professor Ken Stein. Professor Stein is a professor. He's the head of the Israel Studies Center at Emory University, and he's turned it into an educational hub for schools and summer camps and youth groups all across the country. He's done wonderful work in Israel education and training Israel educators. In his academic specialty, he's a specialist in American foreign policy in the Middle East. Worked for a while with Jimmy Carter and then broke with Carter when Carter became Carter. And has continued to be an observer and an analyst of American foreign policy. His topic will be American foreign policy in a changing Middle East. He'll speak at 11:30 in the Sher Lapadi, and then we'll break for lunch. It's lasagna. And then after lunch, we'll gather back here, and we'll have a conversation with Ken here, where we can further get deeper into the details of the Middle East and America's role there. So please come and join. He's a wonderful teacher. He's an old friend of mine. It's lovely to have him. This coming week on Tuesday night, which is March 5th, Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of the ADL, is coming to speak to us about hate and anti-Semitism. You can RSVP. If you go online, you'll see the announcement everywhere. Just put ADL at VBS and you'll get it. But if you forget to RSVP, just tell the hosts or the guards that you're a member of VBS and that I ask you to come. Okay? And they'd love to have you. Okay, so here, Valley Beth Shalom. It's a synagogue in Encino. On Tuesday, well, right now it's on the Great Ventura River. It's the Densmore tributary to the, yeah. It's Tuesday night, which is this coming Tuesday night, March 5th, at 7:30, I think he's speaking. Okay, and he's an interesting guy. You've seen him on TV a lot. Has a lot to say about hate crimes and especially anti-Semitism in America. Okay, that's on Tuesday. Next Shabbos, Elise Berkeley, who's the Southern California leader of JNF, will be our guest to talk about what JNF does. And in 2 weeks, Adam Milstein, who's the head of the IAC, and is going to be talking to us about anti-Semitism as well. He'll talk from the B-Man also as a shiur. So each Shabbos, we're going to have a guest speaker to help us understand our situation a little bit better. What? No, I'm going to be here. I'm playing host, you know. I'm just watching the news day by day. So, and then Sherry, who's not here today because she's in Costa Rica. Hi, Sherry. She's having a big birthday on March 23rd, and she's put together brunch for all of us. So there'll be a celebratory brunch for Sherry on March 23rd. Anyway, welcome. It's good to have you all here. Shabbat Shalom. The verse that's the guiding verse for the end of the book of Exodus is Exodus 25:8. It says, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. God says to Moshe, let them make me a mikdash. Mikdash means a holy place. And I will dwell among them. God wishes to have a dwelling place in the world. And God wishes us to build it. And the last 5 Torah portions of the book of Exodus deal with this issue. How do you build a dwelling place for God in the world? So we have 2 Torah portions, Truma and Titzaveh, which give God's instructions for doing this. Here's the stuff that you'll take from the people, all the finest stuff, gold, silver, jewels of all kinds, fabrics of all kinds. And then make of this the Ark of the Covenant, which is a box with these angel characters on top, surrounded by a tent, surrounded by a portico. And then the vestments of the priests, all of this is laid out in those 2 Torah portions. And then in the 2 Torah portions this week and next week, Moshe is going to do all of this. He's going to appoint a man named Betzalel, the first great Jewish artist. And Betzalel is a man, the Torah says, is filled with chokhmah. He's filled with skill. He's filled with wisdom. And he creates the shrine, and he creates the vestments of the priests. And at the very end of the book, at the end of next week's Torah portion, this will be initiated and God's presence will come and live in it. So the question is, what does it mean to say that? What does it mean to create a human-made, a man-made, human-created institution in which divinity dwells, in which divinity rests? Human beings tend to be, kind of difficult and corrupt. And how do you create something which is perfect and pure enough for God to dwell? And the contrast between human fallibility and divine purity, or human beings' penchant for sin and for mistakes, and our understanding of God as pure and good becomes an interesting drama that continues down to this day. And last week there was this very touching story, or painful story, of the conference in Rome where the church is trying to make amends and trying to take seriously the sex abuse problems of the Catholic Church. And it's this problem of how do you create a human institution with all of our fallibility that reflects the purity of God? And synagogues certainly have the same kinds of issues. I mean, this becomes the great problem. And in the middle of that, and as a symbol of that, in the middle of those 4 Torah portions, Truma Titzaver, where God gives the instructions, and Vayakhel Pikudei, where Moshe carries them out, you have the Torah portion of Ki Tisa, last week's portion, which is the golden calf story. And the golden calf story, it's smack in the middle. Every commentator, from the earliest commentators, recognized that story doesn't belong there. It must have happened earlier. But it's stuck right in the middle there as a sort of warning sign. You know, be careful, because the penchant to, first of all, the penchant to worship the symbol instead of the God that it points to worship the institution, to make the institution sacred instead of the God that it serves, and the penchant to project into the institution all of our own problems and all of our own fallibility and end up with a very fallible, very broken religious expression. This is what that Torah portion's doing there. So for each one of these, it occurs to me that there's like a really interesting sort of question being asked. So this week's Torah portion begins with the following words. You don't have to open it. I'll just read it. You just take a look. It happens to be on 552, but don't bother. It's okay. Right? Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem ela advarim asher tziva Adonai la'asot otam. Moshe, the word is Vayakhel, which means from the word kahal. The word kahal means a congregation, a community. Moses gathers the community together. This is not going to be the project of Moses. This is not even going to be the project of Moses and his brother Aaron, who will be the priest. This is the project of the whole community. An institution is the expression of an entire community. It is, in fact, the entire community. It is an act of will. I mean, you look around you and you say, oh, VBS, big synagogue. VBS is the collective act of will of 1,500 families. I mean, 1,500 families came together. We want there to be a shul, and we want there to be a school, and we want there to be a place, and we decide this is what it is. It's a gathering of the community. It's a gathering. It's the expression of the will of the community. So this institution is the expression of the will, the vision, the values of a particular community. And Moshe gathers the community, and he says, this is what God wants us to do. This is what God wants us to do. God wants us, the community, to will itself into a certain format, to create a place in the world where God can dwell. Now, it's an interesting idea. Create a place in the world where God can dwell. Now, what's going to happen is, if you follow this, if you look at the Torah portion, if you stick around for a while, there's the Haftorah. What's going to happen, of course, is that what Moshe is going to build is a tent. Moshe is going to build a tent. Then we're going to arrive in Canaan, and we're going to settle in Canaan as tribes, and the tent is going to get stuck in a guy's garage. I am not kidding. It gets stuck in a guy's garage. There's a shrine where everybody goes, but the whole accoutrements, it's a tent, and it's stored. And then 200 years go by, and King David becomes king of Israel, and he conquers the city of Jerusalem, and he carries the whole thing, the tent and the ark, all of it up to Jerusalem, and he puts it across the street from the palace. He builds a palace for himself, and he has God across the street. And it occurs to him, there's something wrong. He says, I live in a palace, and God lives in a tent. This is pasnisht, not right. So he says, I want to build God a temple. And the prophet Nathan comes to him and says, no, don't build him a temple. I like living in a tent. This is how and if you think about the religious symbolism, Sandy, come in, find a place, plenty of room today. The religious symbolism of tent versus building. Tent versus building, right? First of all, tent is portable. Building is permanent, right? If you want to say God inhabits the world, which would you rather have, tent or building? Tent, right. Tent is expandable. Building is Well, I can tell you that you can expand a building, but it's real expensive. Trust me on this one. Trust me on this, right? Which reminds me, if any of no. You put a building up someplace, and now you start to believe not that God lives in the universe and this building points us toward God, but that God lives in that building. So for the next, from about 1000 BCE to 586, for about 400 years, we have a temple. And then the Babylonians destroy it. And we go off to exile. And we come back 75 years later and rebuild it. And you have it goes for another 400 years. So for 1,000 years, we have a temple in Jerusalem. That was on that little mountain that's called the Temple Mount. Today, it's covered by that very attractive golden domed building, right? There are some people who want to rebuild the temple on that site by excavating that very attractive golden dome building. Not recommended by most world experts, but it's their aspiration. Because they figure that the temple itself is a sort of special closeness to God, and that place has a special closeness to God. So you've all been to Jerusalem, right? You know that wall? If you can't get to Jerusalem, by the way, at the Getty Center, they have the same wall. But the one in Jerusalem is supposed to be closer to God. So you go and you stick notes in that wall. And the wall's really holy. Well, is it really? What makes that wall any holier than any other wall? Right? Well, because it's supposed to be closer to where God was, you see. I mean, so this becomes the ideology of building. You see how that works? If it was tent, God's everywhere. But if it's building, God's there. At the same time, as we go into exile, we develop another attitude, which is really very radical. If you go back to the verse in Exodus says something. It doesn't say what you think it's going to say. It says, Asuli Mikdash, make me a shrine, make me a holy place. V'shachanti, and it should say bitocho, I will live in it. But it doesn't say that. It says, Asuli Mikdash, make me the holy place. V'shachanti bitocham, which means I will live among you. I'll live where the people live. God lives where the people live. So you have an ideology which begins in diaspora. It exists in Israel for 400 years, and then it becomes our diaspora philosophy, which is God dwells wherever the Jewish people dwell. Wherever 10 of us get together to learn, to pray, to be together, to care for each other, divinity lives. I have really bad news for you. There's no divinity that lives on the corner of Densmore and Ventura other than you. Now, the idea, by the way, that God goes only to special places, that we never lost. We never lost. That's why you have the Kotel. That's why you have the Kotel. In the Bible, wherever God appears, that becomes a shrine place. So the famous one is Bethel. Bethel, which is a few minutes north of Yerushalayim, is where Jacob had his dream. And after the dream, he puts some rocks there, and he anoints the rocks, and Bethel becomes a shrine. To this day, it's a shrine. Because God showed up there. Well, if God showed up there, it must be a holy place. Now, what's really interesting is the Christian community adopted this idea. Well, it started as Jews, of course, right? So the Christian community has this idea that you can build a cathedral any place there was a saint who did a miracle. Right? So if you have a saint who did a miracle, you build a cathedral there, right? You have the Cathedral of Our Lady of the whatever, of the potato, right? And because a saint showed up, and that's how you know God blessed that place. What happens if you want to build a cathedral and you don't happen to have a saint who did anything there? Well, you get a relic. Anyone ever been to European monastery cathedrals? They have a thing called a reliquary. What's a reliquary? It's not just a souvenir shop. What a reliquary is if I don't have a saint who did anything well, I can go get a piece of something that's been blessed. So it was a big sport in medieval Europe to go get pieces of the cross. So every church in Europe has a shrine with a crystal piece of the cross, a sliver of the cross. Now, if you put all of those together, you could not only build a cross, you could probably build all of the Vatican, because every church in Europe has one of them, right? Or the finger of St. Anne. I was at a church in Venice, it was the finger of St. Anne. Mazel tov, or the leg bone of St. Whatever, right? Or you can do what the town fathers in Venice did. The town fathers in Venice had a really great, they wanted to build a beautiful cathedral in their brand new town square, right? So what did they do? They went and sacked Constantinople, stole the body of St. Mark, brought it to Venice, buried it, and then built the cathedral on top of it, San Marcos. In the basement of Cathedral San Marcos is St. Mark, right? St. Shalom, St. Mordechai, right? In Spain, the most farthest point in Europe is Santiago de Compostela, which is the great pilgrimage site. It's built over the grave of Santiago. Santiago is St. James. St. James is Yitzchak, right? Brother Yitzchak, who is Jesus' brother, was said to have gone off to the end of the world to proselytize, to evangelize, and died in Santiago de Compostela, and this beautiful cathedral is built over his grave. You built, that idea, that's how you know it's, but the church also adopted our idea, which is wherever 10 of us get there, there's nobody buried under VBS. Jimmy Hoffa, right. The last 5 synagogue presidents, you know. Right. All the catering revenue, right. What? 4? Sorry. You know, although somebody suggested that, you know. It's the idea is that we gather together, and here in the gathering, that's what brings divinity to bear on this space. But you can see all of these attempts. I'm not making fun of it, but it's interesting to me. The relics, the saints, they're all trying to figure out, how do human beings build a place where God can be accessed? Okay. The Jewish community in diaspora then arrives at this idea of synagogue. And synagogue is wherever 10 of us gather together, that becomes a place of sanctity, right? And that's the great ideology of synagogues. That's how one of the ways that we survived diaspora. Because it meant that wherever we went, we could create holiness. Wherever we went, and you all know this, and I'll show you how you know this. If you're davening, which way do you turn? Toward the east, which is Yerushalayim. With one exception. If there is a Sefer Torah in the room, which way do you turn? Toward the Sefer Torah. So that's not east. That's east, right? That's why the Mizrach is on that wall. But when we daven in this room, we turn that way. How come? Because that's the Sefer Torah. Which means what? Which means Jerusalem is wherever we put the Torah, not where it really is geographically. It's where it is mythically, not geographically. Did you see that? That's a very powerful statement. You're supposed to build synagogues toward the east. I didn't build this place, right? And for enough money, I could make it happen. They asked us, do you want to turn the sanctuary to the east? And we said to them, how much will it cost? And the architect sort of rolled his eyes. So I said, I got the idea, right? But if any of you have this aspiration, what happens then is really very interesting. Synagogues then reflect the community in which it's built. Architecturally, that's for sure. There's no such thing as Jewish architecture. You've been around the world. If you've seen synagogues around the world, what do they tend to look like? Yeah, like the place you're living in, right? So synagogues in the east look like Eastern buildings. Synagogues in the west look like Western, European, right? With the exception, by the way, of America, where, you know, if you're building Wilshire Boulevard Temple, you get a bunch of guys from Warner Brothers Studios who have an idea of what Moorish architecture looks like, and that's what they built, right? I mean, you have this idea of the imagined East, not the real East, okay? So what's interesting is to watch the way these institutions develop. So today what I want to do in the spirit of Parshat Vayakhel, where Moshe gathers the community to build a dwelling place for God, I want to talk about the history of American synagogues, our attempts to build a place where God dwells. And I want to show you the evolution of this institution, because people have a very strange idea about how these institutions got here. So let's talk about the evolution of the American synagogue and how we got here, okay? And I brought you a few words. Everybody see them? We good so far? Now, how many of you are of Eastern European origin? Hands up. Almost all of you. Some of you are Persian. Some of you are German. If you're German, you came here in 1840, 1848, 1850. If you're like us, you're Litvak, Polish, Romanisha, You came between 1884 and 1920, right? Most of you came in 1912. That was the biggest year of immigration, right? If you're Persian, you came in 1979? 79, right. So this is our history, okay? So the first Jews in North America were Sephardim, who came originally from Brazil and then Holland. Then you get the German immigration right before the Civil War, all right? And just before the huge wave of immigration from Eastern Europe comes, we have a little portrait of what Jewish life is at the end of the 19th century in New York City. An editorial from the New York Herald. Now, the New York Herald, despite the name Herald, is not a Jewish newspaper. It's actually, I think it's Pulitzer's newspaper. And this is the editorial. To maintain Judaism in America, something more than a mere recitation of prayers in Hebrew and German is necessary. The people are much more intelligent than they were a century or a half century ago, and any religious system that keeps not up with the progressive spirit of the age must expect to meet just such crises as the Jewish church in America now finds itself. Now, all of you know that our ancestors were much more religious than we are. And synagogues were packed full of people before we got here. Really? This is 1872, and what are they talking about? This is now second-generation German immigrant kids, and what's gone on? They're alienated from their religious life, right? The rising generation demands a form of religion which their hearts can appreciate and hold fast to, though they ask for no change in the true spirit of religion at all, and it is the attempt to confine them to the iron bands of the system of bygone ages. What a great phrase. That has produced results which the Hebrew press so generally and frequently lament, namely that young Israelites do not manifest that love for the synagogue which their fathers and forefathers showed. There was a great historian by the name of Simon Ravitovich at Brandeis University who wrote a very famous essay in Jewish historiography called The Ever-Dying People. And he pointed out that every generation of Jews since the very beginning thinks their kids have lost their faith and that we're the last generation of faithful Jews. So this is 1872, and what's the problem? Kids don't come to shul. We got to do something. And what's the real problem? Is that the synagogue is conducted according to the needs and the language and the custom of their immigrant parents, and the American-born kids aren't coming to shul. What was the solution? Anybody happen to know what the solution was? B'nai B'rith. You know what B'nai B'rith was originally? B'nai B'rith was a fraternity that was started by native-born children of German-American immigrants to create a Judaism that American Jewish kids could resonate to. And it was a fraternity, and then it became a social club. And it was very popular in New York City about this time. But it was the answer to the problem of I'm not going to the synagogue because everything is too German there. I want something that's more American and something that speaks to me. What Ravitovich points out in his essay is the ever-dying people is also an ever-renewing people. Somehow we have found a way, generation after generation, to renew ourselves. And that was the solution here. B'nai B'rith. That plus classical Reform Judaism. Okay? Rightly understood, this very religious indisposition is a sign of progress. It's American-born kids are not interested in what their ancestors brought from the old country, which calls loudly and earnestly on the Jewish church. I think that's a great phrase. To furnish such spiritual food as young American souls can digest. That's the setting before most of the Eastern European Jews got here. There was already a crisis of faith. Uptown, in Midtown, okay? Now I take you to the Lower East Side. And starting in 1884, what happens? 2.5 million Yiddish-speaking, garlic-eating, noisy, Litvaks, Rumänisch, Polish, Russian, Galicianers show up. 2.5 million Jews show up. Now, you ask American Jews, tell me about your ancestors who came to America. And every American Jew says, my grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi. They only let rabbis out of Europe. Tailors, butchers, wagon drivers, none of them left. They all stayed. No, guys. If your father was a great rabbi, he stayed in Europe. I mean, unless he was running for his life. Because this was a wasteland. The first American-born rabbi was a man named Abraham Rice. He was the rabbi of a synagogue in Baltimore in born. The first rabbi in America was Abraham Rice. He was a Bavarian, a German rabbi who came from Germany to run a synagogue in Baltimore. He lasted 3 years. He wrote a letter home to his sister saying, "These people have no Judaism. I'm giving it up." He bought a store and spent the rest of his career running a general store. This was a wasteland of Judaism. But every one of us knows that our ancestors were very Orthodox. So they came to the Lower East Side. What happened on the Lower East Side? What kind of synagogues were there? We'll take a look. This is from the Center for Jewish History, Brief History of New York Synagogues. In the early 1900s, New York City, most notably Lower East Side, was overflowing with synagogues. Well, that's true because they were all Orthodox, right? Yeah. Most of these congregations grew out of a Landsmannschaft. What's a Landsmannschaft? It's an immigrants organization or club of people that came from the same place you came from. Why would you want to be with them? Because you're lonely. Because you're living in a crazy world where they don't speak your language, they don't have your custom. So once in a while, you get together with folks from your part of Poland to speak your language, to be familiar. The Lower East Side synagogues were places you could go and have a little taste of the neighborhood in the old country that you came from. They weren't religious. They were cultural in that sense. They were Landsmannschaft, societies developed by groups predominantly Eastern Europeans came from the same hometown. They were concentrated in areas of their compatriots, Hungarian, Litvak, Lithuania, right? Most met in rented rooms in tenements, storefronts, and meeting halls. In fact, there were buildings that housed several congregations simultaneously, sort of cineplex, right? The congregations were minimally organized, that tradition hasn't changed, and had limited resources. In most cases, Landsmannschaft synagogues did not have a permanent rabbi. Its congregations took turns leading services. The synagogue was much more than a place to pray. It was an entire way of life. Now, how religious were your ancestors? Let me show you. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, estimates of the proportion of Jewish adult male population who attended weekly Sabbath services, 5 to 40%. Most tending toward 20%. Why? How come? You got to work. People work 7 days a week, right? And you didn't want to starve. And because they weren't that religious to begin with. That's also, I mean, they came here because they were letting go of the communities they left behind. The other piece of evidence, which isn't here, is how many mikvahs there were. If you take a population of 2.5 million people, and half of them are women, and half of those women are of childbearing age, then you have, 500,000 women who need mikvahs every month, but there weren't that many. So what do we know? It wasn't as, all ganze frum, as religious as we make it out to be. It was really a cultural attachment. I want to be with people who are like me, who from my part of the world, who speak my language, eat my foods, know my songs, know my story, make me feel at home in this very strange land. That's what the immigrant synagogue was. Okay? And then what happened? And then you have the first, I'll be right with you, Douglas. Then you have the first American-born generation of Jews, and they move out of the Lower East Side out to Brooklyn. Okay? Or in Chicago, where'd you move to? Where was the first settlement in Chicago?
No, it's the south
Maxwell?
side. Highland Park, isn't it?
No, that's way out. That's way
No,
out.
it's the south side, isn't it?
In L.A., you went from Boyle Heights to West Adams. From West Adams, right? Boyle Heights to West Adams, right? In Newark, you went from downtown to Weequahic, where my mother was born, right? Detroit, Boston, every neighbor. You had the first place where people who made a few bucks moved out to. And you have the first American synagogues. Now, parents are immigrants, children are American. So what happened there? Doug, do you have a question?
Yeah, you sat there and said...
I did.
Or when you're reading, that the members took turns leading services.
Yeah, because everybody had some background.
They had to know something
Right,
to lead services.
right. They had some background.
I mean, I never, till I came out here, had a conception that rabbis came to lead Shiva minyans.
Yeah.
Because they never needed to do that where I grew up because
Right.
there were always people there that could lead a service.
Yeah, and we still do have lots of people who can lead services, but there's something about the rabbi coming to bring comfort to a home, which is a nice thing, right? And rabbis are hungry, and there's usually food at Shiva. Israel Goldfarb. Let me tell you first about the book, and then I'll tell you about the guy. I went to the AJU library, Professor Herbst is there, and I was doing some research, and I needed a particular book. Now, the AJU is one of these wonderful libraries that still has stacks you can go through. Lots of them don't anymore, or the books are all digital. So I'm going through the stacks to look for this particular book on the history of American Judaism, and I see a book on the shelf that has no tag on it. Now, to a guy who loves books and libraries, a book in a library that has no tag on it, that's like, woo, that's an invitation. So I pulled this book down, and I opened this book, and this is what I discovered. In 1925 and 1926, the New York Board of what was called Jewish Ministers, which was the New York Board of Rabbis, held a year-long set of conferences on problems of the Jewish ministry, problems of being a rabbi. And this book was the record of that conference, right? One rabbi would be chosen each month to give a paper on a particular topic, and two guys would give responses. Okay? So there were the things ranged from sermons, religious leading services, the rabbi's family, all kinds of interesting topics. And the rabbis were the great rabbis of that age, which happened to be sort of the golden age of the American rabbinate. Stephen S. Wise and Israel Goldstein, Israel Leventhal, David de Solapool, these great, great, great rabbis, these legendary rabbis. So I took that book, I Xeroxed the book because I wanted to keep it because I was afraid it was going to get lost at the university. It didn't have a tag. Now it has a tag. This comes from Israel Goldfarb. Israel Goldfarb was the rabbi of the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, which even today it's a very hip place because Brooklyn's very hip. Kane Street Synagogue, he's known for three things. I'll tell you what he's known for. Number one, he did Aaron Copland's bar mitzvah. All right? He sang his Haftorah to the Appalachian Spring. Right, that's right. Okay? Number two, he doubled it. No rabbi could make a living in a synagogue, so he doubled his time as a professor of music at JTS, and he's the author of Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet. He wrote that melody. And number three, you'll see in a minute what he's famous for. He's famous for an aspect of Jewish life that you're going to go, oh, he's the guy? Watch. He writes the piece on children. This is 1927. The book was published in 1927. He writes this in 1925. This is your grandparents. Of all the problems that beset the American rabbi of today, none is more complex and difficult to solve than that of how to bring the child closer to the synagogue, how to arouse his interest in things Jewish, and how to secure his permanent attachment to the ideals and faith of our people. The problem is of vital importance. It was completely unknown to our predecessors a generation ago. We just don't let go of this idea that our ancestors were much better Jews than we were. Right? He says, because in the old country, the kid lived in a Jewish environment, but here in America, you're going to secular public schools. Right? Here in America, where the Jew has lost his firm grip on his ancient heritage, where his loyalty to the traditions of his father is weakened so much, where the child moves from morning to night in a non-Jewish environment, an atmosphere, the question of inspiring his interest in the synagogue becomes difficult. We are confronted with the test that neither the home nor the synagogue as they're constituted today any longer exert that magnetic power over the child, nor generate the spiritual force which in former generations influenced the child's life and made him conscious of his Jewish responsibilities. Kids aren't learning Judaism. They're not coming to the synagogue. They have no contact with it. They're losing their Jewishness. I mean, what he's saying is something very radical. In Europe, we were politically insecure, but spiritually secure. In America, it's the other way around. In America, you're not so much worried about pogroms, but you're not sure that your kid's going to grow up knowing that he is a Jew. So Goldfarb says it's important for the synagogue to pay attention to kids. So what did he invent? He invented the bar mitzvah. Now, the bar mitzvah was a ritual that we've been doing for generations, doing since the Middle Ages. He's the guy that made it a big deal. He's the guy that put a meal next to it. Right? He sold his soul to the devil, invited a caterer into the synagogue. He made bar mitzvah a big deal. And what that meant was that boys would come and learn with him for a year in order to have a big deal bar mitzvah. And then what happened is after they finished the bar mitzvah, the boys said to the rabbi, we don't want to let go. We like being with you. So on Saturday afternoon, he put together the Akiba Society, which was the first Jewish youth group. The first Jewish youth group were the kids that he taught for bar mitzvah. They stayed and they played basketball, and they learned Pirkei Avot with the rabbi. And then the girls wanted something. Now, he couldn't do bar mitzvahs for girls. That was Mordechai Kaplan, who was uptown. But he put together the Rochel Society, a little group of girls who would gather with him and learn with him. And he's the first one who turned the synagogue toward the child. That's what Israel Goldfarb accomplished, right? And from that, what happens is, you have these experiments in how to create a synagogue. And the great experiment in the synagogue was called the synagogue center. Any of you grew up in a synagogue back east? Any of you grew up in a synagogue back east that had a swimming pool in the basement?
The shul with the pool.
Anybody go to Forest Hills Jewish Center or Hollis Hills Jewish Center? Anyone go to a synagogue that had the word center in the title?
Yeah.
Right. Jewish centers, the synagogue center was conceived as a synagogue not just for prayer and not just for Torah, but for everything Jews do. Now, Mordechai Kaplan, the great founder of Reconstructionism, was not the guy that thought this up, but he was the guy who wrote it up, and he got credit for the idea. And here's basically the idea. Judaism is far more comprehensive than Jewish religion, which means a synagogue has to be more than just prayer and learning, right? It includes the nexus of history, literature, language, social organization, folk sanctions, standards of conduct, social and spiritual ideals, aesthetic values, which in their totality form a civilization. In other words, Judaism is anything that Jews want to do. So, if Jews want to play basketball, make that part of the shul. If Jews want to have a knitting circle, make that part of the shul. If Jews need lectures on politics, make that part of the shul. He says, what endangers civilization is not the preoccupation with civilization's majority culture, but the irrelevance, remoteness, and vacuity of Jewish life. He never held back. There's little at present in Jewish life that offers a field of self-expression to the average man and woman who's not engaged as a rabbi, educator, or social worker. If one does not have a taste for praying 3 times a day or studying Bible and rabbinic writings, there's nothing in any of the current versions of Judaism to hold one's interest. As a Jew, activities that might hold your interest, which might express oneself as a Jew, have not been recognized as Jewish life. So he creates the first Jewish center, which he basically says, yeah, we'll have prayer, we'll have learning, we'll have bar mitzvah, but anything else Jews want to do as an expression of their Jewishness is welcome here and is sanctified. And it's sanctified. And this was the idea. The great fulfillment of this idea was the Brooklyn Jewish Center, led by a brilliant rabbi named Israel Leventhal, who wrote this about his institution: the synagogue must, and this is a phrase from the Talmud, Shaul keneged shamayim va'aretz. It's a thread connecting heaven and earth. The highest ideals of religious life, which needs of our everyday worldly life, so that aretz, earthly life, may reach into shamayim, the heaven, and through inspiration of our heavenly ideals, mold a better, nobler existence. The Brooklyn Jewish Center, he was very proud, was a 24/6 institution. But even on Shabbos, it was open. It had everything in it. In fact, it had everything in it so good, and he had a particular taste for quality. So the social and artistic director, the artistic director was Mark Rothko. Okay? The drama director was Mace Hart. And the cantor was Richard Tucker. Okay, so Mace Hart became this big Broadway producer. Mark Rothko, you know, is one of the great artists of the 20th century, and Richard Tucker was the great singer for the opera. Okay, because you're going to show Jewish culture, show it at its best. And it was a place that was full of people all the time. Now, those of you who are members of VBS, you have some sense in which this institution mirrors that. because Kaplan's student was Harold Schulweis, right? And that's where you get this connection. Now, just as a footnote, your institution was founded by him too. He was the one who came up with the idea of a university of Judaism, right? A university that would contain the entire cultural expression of the Jewish people. This was Mordechai Kaplan. This was the solution to the second generation. If I can't get kids in here to daven, get them in here playing basketball. Then, when it's minyan time, go see if you can invite a few of the kids to come and stand in a minyan. Right? If I can't get kids to study Torah, teach them Jewish cooking. They'll have a connection to culture. You see the strategy here? If I can't get people to come for the religious life of a synagogue, let's give them the full panoply of Jewish cultural existence. That's what a synagogue is supposed to be. Right? We have a Tai Chi class here early in the morning. My Zayda would not recognize that. What is those epis mishigas? He says, gedavening. Oh, gedavening. You know, they're praying, Zayda. They're praying. Right? It's just, but anything Jews do then becomes holy. Now, the objection to this came from other rabbis, this is going to be really ironic for those of you who live in the neighborhood. The guy who objected this most vociferously was Stephen S. Wise. Right? He gives the graduation address. He gives the graduation address at Hebrew Union College in 1923. And he says to this bunch of rabbis, you don't need bowling alleys and gymnastics classes and cooking. He says, if you have something to say to these people that fills you with living fire, he's talking to rabbis, it will not be necessary to have music or cooking classes or bowling alleys or gymnastics in order to bring men and women to the source of things for which they must long. If you feel this, you can preach in such seething syllables as to make them feel it, and unless you preach in this way, I advise you to go into some other honest occupation. Stephen Weiss said, look, you don't need all this stuff. If you have something to say to people from Torah, from your faith, that's what Judaism is. So he objected to this wildly, vociferously. Now, Stephen Weiss started a synagogue in Manhattan called the Free Synagogue. What had happened was Stephen Weiss was born here, educated here, right? Went to Europe to study, came back, became the assistant rabbi at Beth Yeshurun, and then went to Oregon, Portland, Oregon, where he was rabbi for 6 years. And then at the age of 26, he was invited to become the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of New York, which at the time was the biggest synagogue in the world, right? 26 years old, because he was a brilliant preacher, 6'2", 6'4", big guy, powerful voice. And at the interview, he aces the interview, and then just before he finishes the interview, Lewis Marshall, who is the most powerful lawyer in America and is the chairman of the search committee and the chairman of the board, says, of course, before you preach anything, you will review it with the board of directors. So I said, excuse me? He says, yes, we don't want you preaching politics that might offend our congregants. So before you preach anything, you have to review it by the board of directors. So Wise looks at him and says, are you kidding me? And they tried to make peace. Strauss tried to make peace, and he couldn't do it. So Wise goes back to Portland, Oregon, and he sends back his response to the search committee. They offer him the job, by the way. And he sends back his response. But you know, when you're Stephen Weiss, you don't just send a letter, a telegram saying, no, thank you, it's not the job I want. He published it as an editorial in the New York Times. And it basically says, go to hell. He said, any preacher who has to pass his opinions by a board of directors is not a preacher. The prophets of Israel didn't have to get permission for what they said. If this is what you think preaching is, we're not right for each other. And he puts it on the editorial page of the New York Times. A year later, he moves to New York and starts a new synagogue called the Free Synagogue. It's free in both senses. It doesn't cost you anything to go, and he can say whatever he wants with no one telling him what to do. They meet on Sundays. No, not because he wants you to go to your synagogue on Saturday and then go hear him on Sunday at Carnegie Hall. And he filled Carnegie Hall for 50 years, every Sunday morning. It was also broadcast on the radio. Okay? It's also, you can hear him in his sermons. I mean, amazing, very political. very political. In fact, the great story is that he'd raised, during the First World War, the U.S. Steel wanted to unionize, and President Wilson said to the steel workers, don't unionize, I need the steel. But as soon as the war's over, you can unionize. The war ended 1917. 1920, the U.S. Steel, the steel workers wanted to organize, and the U.S. Steel's, Judge Gary at the time, brought in the Pinkerton detectives to beat the organizers and stop the unionization. Stephen Weiss was pro-union, and he had raised $20 million to build a synagogue in uptown Manhattan. And he said to his wife one morning, I'm about to go blow the whole building fund. And she kissed him on the cheek and said, you do that, darling. And he went and gave this fiery sermon about how the steelworkers have a right to unionize, and only an undemocratic corporate leadership would do what U.S. Steel is doing. And of course, all the donors pulled back their donations, and the synagogue didn't get built till 1948. Right? I mean, this is who the guy is. So you have these models of synagogue life. You have these models of synagogue. It's still there, but now they have a building. I mean, and Ami Hirsch is the rabbi there. Now comes the Second World War, and 3 million Americans go overseas to fight, including many hundreds of thousands of Jews. And after the war, what happens? They come back. It's 1945. You have the GI Bill. Guys go to college. And what happens to GIs who come back from the war? They come back and they marry their high school girlfriends, right? And they need a place to live. And where do they decide to go live? Yes, you have the birth of suburbia. Arthur Levitt is a Jewish builder who learned something in the war. He learned in the war that you can build many tanks, and the way you build tanks is on an assembly line, right? You can build battleships on an assembly line. You can build airplanes on an assembly line. Let's build houses the same way. So he buys a tract of land in Long Island, brings in a crew of workers, and teaches them how to build it, and it's the beginning of tract housing. There were 3 tracts, and you could buy a 2-bedroom house with a little yard for, yeah, $3,000. Yeah. Well, there were African Americans, lots of issues, and so he does it in Long Island. Then he does another one near Philly it's now called Cherry Hill. It's Cherry Hill, and it spreads out. And here in L.A., he didn't do it in L.A. But the guy who did it here in L.A. was Boyer and Taper. Okay, Boyer, the Boyer's the builder, and Taper was the banker. And I lived in one of those houses, right? I grew up in one of those houses out in the West Valley. These parks, these big areas where you build lots and lots of houses that all look alike. But now you have now you get Highland Park, right, Illinois. You have large populations of young Jews. What?
No, Skokie was the first.
Yeah, Skokie, then you just move up. You just.
And in Chicago, they had something called the ACA.
Yeah, right. But in Chicago, you moved up the lake, right? Yeah, Evanston, Northbrook, Deerfield, Highland Park, and then in California, you move out to the valley, right? Detroit, it's Bloomfield and West Bloomfield and Southfield. What? Oak Park, right? Every town has this. But what happened now is you have a large population of young Jews living far away from their parents. And they're newly married, and you have a baby boom. The birth rate in the United States after the Second World War was 3.7 children per woman. That's huge. I mean, 1.7 is, it's now 1.7. It went back down to 1.7. Replacement is 2.1. 3.8, that's this boom of kids born. You have these large populations. And what happens? You're in the middle of Levittown, and you say, you know what? We should get the kids into Hebrew school. We should do something. So here is the membership brochure of Levittown Jewish Center. Many of our people have had little previous contact with synagogue life, having hitherto regarded synagogue as the province of their elders. Many have not seen the inside of a shul since their bar mitzvah. Now, however, they feel that it's time that they grow up and have consequently acquired a renewed interest in synagogue activity. But why? Why do they want a synagogue?
The
right? The responsibilities of parenthood have led many to rethink their position with regard to the Jewish heritage, which they now seek to maintain in order to be able to transmit it to their children. Do they want to daven? Learn Torah? They want two things. What do they want? They want a social group that gives them, some community in the middle of a very lonely existence. Because remember, you left downtown and you went out to the suburbs. You didn't know anybody. I mean, there were no trees out there. Everyone's living in a brand new house. Everyone's your age. Your friends that you grew up with, that you went to high school with, your cousins that you grew up in the same building with, they live 2 hours away. You need people you want to be together with. You want a social group, and you want some kind of Jewish education for your children. You want Jewish education. You don't want your kids growing up not knowing who they are, right? So the Episcopal Church on the corner has Sunday school. We need Sunday school. They want to the responsibilities of parenthood have led many to rethink their position with regard to the Jewish heritage, which they now seek to maintain in order to be able to transmit it to their children. That's the key phrase. Do I want Judaism for myself? Nah. What do I want? I want to transmit it to my children. Now think about that for a minute. It's a paradox, right? In Levittown, this return to Judaism is facilitated for them through the existence of a synagogue consisted of like-minded Jewish parents. So what happened in the 1950s, there used to be separate institutions. You had a synagogue and you had a Talmud Torah, a Hebrew school. The Talmud Torah then became part of the suburban synagogue. Okay? And the Talmud Torah becomes a place to learn Judaism. But there's a basic paradox in that identity. And the paradox is picked up by Herb Gans, who's a famous sociologist, who studies Highland Park. This is his study of, it's Highland Park, Illinois. And he notes the following. The Sunday school, much as other Jewish institutions, is recognizably an ethnic rather than religious institution. Ethnic meaning it's cultural. It's about culture, not religion. More correctly, an American reaction to an ethnic situation, which transmits ethnic behavior and identity. The Jewish home, however, is run by American middle-class behavior patterns. The women are the mothers who set up the Sunday school in Highland Park. The women feared that the contradiction between the traditional Jewish home, whose features now incorporated in the Sunday school curriculum, and the American home, which embody their primary present-day values, would lead to family tensions. So although they wanted their children to learn about traditional Jewish life, they did not want it brought home. Don't make our kids too Jewish. Make them Jewish enough, but not too Jewish. Anybody recognize this? Right? Billy, this is a Hebrew school we grew up in, right? Right? Why? Because these are young Jewish moms who had left behind the homes of their moms because they felt they were stifling. They wanted something new. They wanted something American. This was a breath of fresh air, new life. So they want their kids to know that they're Jewish, feel that they're Jewish, connect to their Jewishness, but not go too far. So that's the Hebrew school, right? So although they wanted the situation in Park Forest, which was Highland Park, Illinois, is that many parents reject involvement in cultural aspects of Jewish tradition for themselves as adults, while they demand that their children involve themselves to the extent of learning about this tradition without, however, getting so involved as to wish to practice it. Does that sound familiar to anybody? You want to know why we're in a Farblunget situation? Because that's the Hebrew school that many of us came from. So Jack Wertheimer, who's a professor of American Jewish history at JTS, he sort of summarizes the post-war moment. And for those of you who know Valley Beth Shalom, this is us, okay? It was a time of explosive quantitative growth for the American synagogue, post-war. In 1957, the Synagogue Council of America, that's the group that organized Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform synagogues. It doesn't exist anymore, but once there was, estimated a grand total of 4,200 congregations, more than double the number 50 years earlier, and about 1,000 more than immediately before World War II. So, people moved out to the valley, and in 1950 they met in I don't know, Frank Weiner or Al Liebson's house, and they formed Valley Beth Shalom on Sepulveda. And then they moved over here when this property became available. That's what this story is. The Reform Movement's UAHC grew from 290 temples in 1937 to 698 in 1970. In the same period, the United Synagogue, the conservative movement, went from 250, right, to 832. Not 832.13, that's the footnote. 832. Just in 1 2-year period of the 1950s, 131 new congregations joined, right? But now, that's synagogues being built, okay? How about people going to shul? Because you'd say, well, surely if they're building synagogues, it must be this boom in religious life, right? Attendance at religious services, by contrast, did not keep pace with membership growth, right? A survey conducted by the National Opinion Research Center found that in 1945, that only 24% of Jews claimed to attend services once a month, compared to 81% of Catholics and 62% of Protestants. A mere 9% attend once a week. According to Gallup, a decade later, the figure for Jewish once-a-week synagogue attendance rose to 18%, as compared to 74% for Catholics and 40% for Protestants, right? But research in local communities suggests that figure was inflated. People lied to the survey taker. By 1970, the Jewish population study determined that only 8% of Jewish household heads attend religious services 50 times or more a year, whereas percent attended fewer than 4 times a year. So what does that mean? We build synagogues, we join synagogues, but we don't go to synagogue. How come? Because, as he said, it's an ethnic, no, it's not work anymore. Because the synagogue is an ethnic institution, not a religious institution. That in the post-war synagogue, that's what the post-war synagogue was. It's a place where you found friends, right? It's a place where you found community. It's a place where you belong and had a sense of belonging and sent your children to the Hebrew school but didn't go because you didn't feel, it didn't compel you. You didn't have a sense of religious life. It also gained a lot of criticism. So in 1953, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great philosopher, addresses my union, the Rabbinical Assembly, and this is what he says about synagogue. Now, Heschel was a young European scholar, and he was invited all across the country to visit synagogues, give speeches in synagogues. So this is what he says about us. He says, our services are conducted with pomp and precision. The rendition of the liturgy is smooth, everything is present, decorum, voice, ceremony. But one thing is missing, life. Nothing is going to happen to the soul. Our motto is monotony. The fire has gone out of our worship. It is cold, stiff, and dead. Inorganic Judaism. Don't hold back. Tell us what you really think, right? Has the synagogue become the graveyard where prayer is buried? The modern synagogue suffers from a severe cold. What a line. I mean, good God. Our congregants preserve a respectful distance between the prayer book and themselves. The services are prim, the voice is dry, the synagogue is clean and tidy, the soul of prayer lies in agony, the words are stillborn.
He could write.
He could write it. And he's a little angry, you think? I'll give you a hint. He wasn't invited back for 10 years. Right, what was he seeing? What was he seeing in those synagogues? Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true, but he was seeing people had this, they joined synagogue. I mean, he's talking, 1953, it's actually 1970, but in 53, you're talking about the time when there were the most Jews who belonged to synagogues to the most number of American synagogues that there were, right? And the most number of Jewish kids in Hebrew school. But something was missing, right? Some kind of soul was missing, right? There was something was missing because people, they were sending their kids, these institutions were being founded and funded out of a sense of, I don't know, guilt, inertia, ethnic attachment, but there wasn't a sense of, there was something missing. This is the post-war suburban synagogue. Yes, please. Hang on, we have a microphone so that the folks at home can hear you.
This drop-off of synagogue participation come and the relationship and the development of Jewish federations and United Jewish Appeals around
that's a very interesting set of questions too. First of all, it wasn't a drop-off. It wasn't a drop-off. That's the point. It wasn't that there was a lot of people going to shul and suddenly the next generation came and they all abandoned synagogue. There never was. It never was a mass movement. People were affiliated as Jews. They were identified as Jews. They knew language. They knew custom. Even today, by the way, according to the Pew report, 94% of us report that we're proud to be Jewish. 93% of us attend a Passover Seder. 86% of us light Hanukkah candles, right? But only 30% of us belong to anything. It's a very, it never was a drop-off. That's the interesting thing, right? But now your question is really good. So you do have an impulse. You do have an impulse to support the community. During the war, there was a huge movement to support the refugees. I mean, they didn't know about the Holocaust, but there was a huge movement at home to support the refugees. After the Holocaust, after the war, you had a huge movement to support the State of Israel. The biggest moment to support the State of Israel was 1967. Anybody live here in LA in 1967? Anybody go to the Hollywood Bowl on that Saturday? All right, so if you know what I mean, those of us who grew up here, Jews in LA in the 1960s were invisible, right? Edgar Magden was the rabbi, and he was an American rabbi who wouldn't be caught with a yarmulke if it killed him, right? And then one day, during the Six-Day War, there was such a sense of crisis in the community that the community called a rally at the Hollywood Bowl. Anybody remember this story? Right? So the Hollywood Bowl seats 25,000 people. 40,000 people showed up. Those of us who got there early had a seat. Others had to stand out in the parking lot. Right? And the program began. Anybody remember how the program began? Frank Sinatra, who I didn't know was Jewish. I just thought he was Italian. Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand walk out on stage. Sinatra sings the national anthem and talks about his love of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. And Barbra Streisand sings Hatikva. Now, if the chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra, is proud to be a Jew, he's not, but it's okay to be Jewish for him. It suddenly became really cool to be Jewish in LA. Right? Right? Ross Martin, who was the guy on Wild Wild West, was the MC. And every Hollywood star you ever heard of, whose names had all been changed, showed up on stage to declare their affiliation with the Jewish people. Right? Now, what did that mean? That was the beginning. That was really the flower. There was a Jewish Federation since the 1930s, but that was the moment that Jewish Federation really rose up, because that was the moment that Israel became a Jewish problem, a Jewish cause, a Jewish mission. And that's where Federation really was ignited. Before that, it was a welfare federation for immigrants and for the poor and for things, but that's the moment that it really became. 67 was really the moment that it really flowered. So now you have this third generation American synagogue, which is, send the kids, but don't make them too Jewish. Join the shul, but don't go. Really interesting Jews. But now we move to the next generation, and things are going to change again. Because the Holocaust has a decisive effect on Jewishness in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, but by the 1990s it changes. Douglas.
When I'm listening to everything you're saying,
Everything.
It's sort of like you're saying all these problems that we're thinking about today,
yeah,
there's nothing new under the sun.
No, it's not that there's nothing new under the sun, but what I want to show you is two things. Number one, that the synagogue in America, as Jewish life in America in general, has always been improvisational, experimental. We've never settled on a pattern of Jewish life. We're still trying to figure it out. It's always been improvisational. When you read Goldfarb, you read a guy who had a brilliant Talmudic education in Europe before he came to America, and he comes to America and he honestly doesn't know what to do. He creates the bar mitzvah because he honestly doesn't know how to navigate America, right? And this has been in every generation, this improvisational kind of sense of how do we move the institution to meet the populace? How do we move the institution and recreate the institution to talk to the soul of the populace? And at the same time, you see the evolution of Jewish identity in America. And each stage, you could honestly have said what Davidovich said was, this is the end. I mean, hell, if you read Goldfarb, there really should never have been a third generation of American Jews. But people came back from the war, settled in suburbia, and decided they wanted something Jewish. So there is some attachment, some connection that motivates this people. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
There's one 800-pound gorilla in the room that today that that's not been addressed.
Yeah.
Intermarriage.
Well, that's coming. I'm about to get to that. Right. So intermarriage is one of, but see, yes and no. Intermarriage is a symptom of the same process of intermarriage.
It could be the death knell.
It could be, just like everything else could have been the death knell. But it's a symptom of this question of what is identity, what does it mean to be Jewish, what does it mean to belong, right? What am I looking for in my Jewishness? What institutional expression does my Jewishness take? That's exact. So we're going to finish. So let me just show you what I gave you here. In about the middle of about the end of the 20th century, you had another shift in identity because you had another generation, right? If you consider the first generation is the immigrant generation that comes from Europe, and the second generation is the first American-born generation, Lower East Side to Brooklyn, and the third generation is that suburban generation, post-war. Then you have fourth, fifth, and sixth generation. That is millennials, Generation X, millennials. Those are the people now populating synagogues. So something happens at the end of the 20th century. Certain kinds of movements people are interested in certain kinds of things that they weren't interested in before. Okay, namely personal meaning. So there's a study. This is a sociological study of the American Jewish community that was conducted at the end of the 20th century and written up by Stephen Cohen, who's a demographer and sociologist, and Arnie Eisen, who at the time was a Jewish studies professor at Stanford. Now he's the chancellor of the seminary. And let me just read you two or three lines of this. They're describing us. They're describing our Jewish community at the end of the 20th century. He says, the single most important finding of our study is decidedly double-edged. Now, double-edged means you have to be Talmudic about this, right? Use your fingers. Ready? The first language that our subjects speak is by and large one of profound individualism. The language is universalist, liberal, and personalist. Community, though a buzzword in our interviews, a felt need, even a real hunger for some, is a second language subordinate to the first. Our subjects, like Americans more generally today, do not speak it as often or as well. Individualism means I don't define myself by the community I belong to. I don't define myself by my faith. I define myself as an independent, autonomous, they call it sovereign self, seeking meaning. So he says community and commitment, in fact, are repeatedly redefined and apprehended by our subjects in terms acceptable to sovereign, ever-questing selves. Sovereign means I maintain the ability to enter or leave whatever kinds of commitments by embracing values that give me a sense of my personal meaning. And ever-questing means it's never a finished process. I'm always looking for the next thing that will define me. Right? Only in those terms is commitment possible and community permitted to obligate the self. They repeatedly reconsider which organizations and charities they will join and support, and to what degree, which beliefs they hold, which loyalties they acknowledge. The self is and must remain autonomous and sovereign. It's about me and my sense of satisfaction, right? Yet, now here's the yet. So here's the other Talmudic fact, right? Here the postmodern story weighs in. Postmodern is a fancy way of saying that in this cultural environment, you can have contradictory forms of identity layered on top of each other. I mean, I told you this story about my neighbor who stopped coming to VBS because he wanted something more traditional, so he goes to Chabad, but in the afternoon he goes shopping at Costco with his wife. No, don't laugh. That's exactly right. Because that's his, and I respect that. I really do. I respect him. He doesn't, from a traditional standpoint, that's contradictory. But from a postmodern standpoint, you can have both, right? You know, you can have a non-kosher home, but make everything very kosher for Passover. So somebody literally called me once and asked me what Pesach dessert I can bring if they're serving ham for the Seder. I don't know, one of those chocolate cakes. No, the guy was very honest. He was very honest about it. I mean, I'm not criticizing. Honest to God, postmodern means that these identities can all be lined up. Now, don't make fun because they really are. You know, right? The young woman who's been living with her boyfriend for the last 3 years wants to get married and wants to go to mikveh before the wedding. Right? Okay. Yet, here the postmodern story weighs in. The labor of fashioning a Jewish self remains deeply significant to moderately affiliated American Jews. We can state with confidence that the quest for Jewish meaning is extremely important to our subjects, just as the search for meaning is important to contemporary Americans. Middle-range American Jews, that's us, seek an abiding significance in their lives that goes beyond the activities of daily life and the limits of their mortality. They readily discuss their highly personal searches for transcendent meaning and confess to a degree that surprised us a belief in God. Our subjects report a strong desire to find a sense of direction and ultimate purpose, and wish to find it largely or entirely in the framework of Jewish practice and belief. So what you get here is a very interesting new kind of Jewish identity, just as you did in previous generations. I'll be all right with you, Mark. That tradition didn't anticipate. And just to show you what this looks like, as it were, on the ground, if you'll turn to the last page, this is the mission statement that I pulled off the internet from two contemporary, what they call emerging congregations. Okay? Ikar is one here in LA, and The Kitchen is one in San Francisco. And if you read these words and then compare them to Eisen and Cohen, you'll see how these words end up being programmatic, right? If I'm dealing with people who have a strong sense of wanting to be Jewish, but don't want to be told how to do it, and aren't concerned with contradictions within their identities, so there's an inclusiveness that has to be, right? And they're looking for a certain kind of spiritual expressiveness and emotional expressiveness, but don't know a lot about Jewish life, about how to, this is what you end up with, right? So just take a look here about each of these two. You'll see, look at The Kitchen at the bottom, right? Judaism is about provoking awe and purpose. Now, I don't know if my grandfather would ever have said that. You know, first of all, it's provoking on purpose, which means Judaism is a way of evoking an emotion inside of a person. The purpose of this whole exercise is to give us a feeling, right? That's what we're here for. We believe that Jewish religious practice can transform. Just read these. They're wonderful statements. And the point of this whole exercise was, Vayakhel Moshe. Moshe gathers us together because within the community, God lives. But I want you to see the way in which it's evolved. The community has always been an evolving community. There never was a golden age when everybody went to shul, and now we're the bad Jews who have fallen away from that. That's a myth. We have always been struggling to figure out how do you create a community where God lives? How do you create a community that really touches people's lives and gives them a sense of belonging? That's always been the story of American Jewish life, and it goes on today. All right, I got like a minute, so let's get really very short questions, no speeches, because I have to go name a baby. So in the back and all in the back.
Tension between secularism and Judaism.
Yeah. Well, what is secularism?
I'm asking you.
I mean, the point is, Jews have never been comfortable talking about God until now. I just did a series. Some of you were here with us. 15 sessions. Rabbi Gelman taught beautifully. 15 sessions on personal theology, my belief in God. Had 15 different rabbis, ministers, teachers come and talk about it. We've never, and it's interesting, this is the first generation since the Hasidim in the 18th century that's ready to talk about their beliefs in God. Certainly, I grew up in a very religious environment, very beautiful, sort of conservative synagogue. Rabbi never talked about God. Never talked about God. Because the Holocaust made it impossible. But even before that, it was a question, people didn't talk about God. So this is the first time we're beginning to evoke questions of religion. In a certain way, we were ethnic, now we're becoming religious. It's a really interesting transition, but we haven't let go of the ethnic culture either. So it's a very, very interesting question. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'd like to say that when I speak with my family members in Israel, every now and then I tell them that I go almost every Saturday to temple.
Yes.
And they are amazed.
Yes.
You're going to temple every Saturday? And I say, yeah, but the temple here is a little different. They have social activities.
So let me interrupt you for a second. So a couple years ago, I was in I go to Israel pretty much in the summer times, and we usually spend Shabbat in Yerushalayim, because there's nothing like Shabbat in Yerushalayim. Right? So what falling in love in Paris is about is Shabbat in Yerushalayim. But one year, my son he wanted to be in Tel Aviv. So he was on Shabbos in Tel Aviv. In the summer, on Friday nights, in Tel Aviv, this group of Argentinian crazy guys lead a Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat on the beach. 800 people are there. Right? There's a bunch of tourists like me, and then there's a bunch of Israelis. And they have a band. It's like our Rimonim service. They have a band, and they play rock and roll versions of the Kabbalat Shabbat service. And there's this guy who gives this little Dvar Torah, and I'm watching this. So here's this guy, this tall, gorgeous Israeli guy, you know, in his Speedo bathing suit and a T-shirt, and the sunglasses up on his head like this, like every Israeli, right? That's his kippah, because there's no kippah on his head. And he's got his kid on his shoulders, right, and a glass of beer in his hand. And he's walking around, and he's singing Lechad Dodi by heart. Israel is also having a revival of this question of Jewish identity and what it is. There's now secular yeshivas all over Israel where people can study texts. There is a revival of a kind of, it's not dati, because dati in Israel means something else. It's authoritarian, political orthodox. But there's a kind of reconnection with the Jewish past and with Jewish forms of the Jewish past that's happening in Israel, all over Israel. And that's why your relatives will say, I'd like to know what you do, because we have a crazy thing here in the neighborhood that's the same thing. It's not conservative or reform. It's Israeli. It's indigenous Israeli. Very interesting stuff. Okay? Listen, I know there's lots of questions, but I need to go. I got to go name a baby. So let me wish all of you good Shabbos. Come and hear Professor Stein this afternoon. Stay with us, and we'll see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.
You were on fire today.
No, it's just really interesting stuff. So, thank you, Mort.